November 6, 1895. St. Thomas Episcopal Church, 5th Avenue and 53rd Street, Manhattan. 300 policemen form a cordon against the crowd. Thousands of spectators, mostly women, have been waiting for hours. Inside, the cream of New York society fills the pews. The Vanderbilts, notably, are mostly absent. The groom, Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, arrived late. The bride arrives 20 minutes later. Anyone who catches a glimpse beneath her veil can see that her face is swollen from crying. The next day, Life magazine will publish a cartoon. It shows the bride kneeling at the altar in her wedding gown, her hands handcuffed behind her back, attached to a chain held by her mother. The artist doesn't need to exaggerate. Everyone who witnessed the ceremony knows what they saw. This isn't a wedding. It's a transaction. The price, $2.5 million in railroad stock. The merchandise, an 18-year-old girl named Consuelo Vanderbilt. Before we continue, if you enjoy deep dives into forgotten history and the hidden stories behind America's grandest estates, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us uncover these remarkable tales of ambition, tragedy, and resilience. This is the story of how the most opulent mansion in America, a marble palace by the sea, became a literal prison for one of the Gilded Age's most beautiful women. How a mother's social ambition destroyed her daughter's chance at love, and how a crumbling English palace became a gilded cage that would trap Consuelo Vanderbilt for 25 years before she finally escaped. But to understand how Consuelo ended up weeping at her own wedding, we need to go back to the beginning, to a childhood that looked golden from the outside, but felt like something else entirely on the inside. Chapter 1. The Golden Child. The device ran from her forehead down her spine to her waist, fastening around her shoulders and hips. It made writing nearly impossible. It forced her to hold books high to read, and it hurt. The steel rod was designed to ensure perfect posture, the kind of ramrod-straight bearing that marked a lady of quality. Consuelo Vanderbilt wore it during her lessons every day for years. Her mother insisted on it. Alva Vanderbilt had rules about everything. The steel rod was just the most visible. There was also the riding crop, which Alva used to whip her daughter for infractions large and small. There were the governesses and tutors who reported directly to Alva, ensuring no moment went unsupervised. There was the educational regimen that had Consuelo fluent in English, French, and German by age 8. And there was the golden rule, stated plainly when teenage Consuelo dared to question her mother's clothing choices. I do the thinking. You do as you are told. Consuelo was born on March 2, 1877 in New York City. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was the grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man who'd built the family's railroad fortune. When William's father died in 1886, William inherited $65 million. Her mother, Alva Erskine Smith, was a Southern belle from Mobile, Alabama, with social ambitions that towered over her considerable wealth. She'd married into the Vanderbilt fortune in 1875. Now she intended to use it. The name Consuelo wasn't random. Alva chose it to honor her friend Consuelo Iznaga, a half-Cuban, half-American socialite who'd created a sensation by marrying George Montague, Viscount Mandeville, in 1876. The marriage combined New World money with Old World aristocracy, exactly the kind of match Alva envisioned for her own daughter. The name was a blueprint, assigned at birth. The Vanderbilts moved in a world of almost incomprehensible luxury. Their primary residence was the Petit Chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1882. Architect Richard Morris Hunt had designed it to Alva's exacting specifications, creating a French Gothic masterpiece that could comfortably host 1,000 guests. On March 26, 1883, Alva threw a masquerade ball to celebrate the house's opening. The party cost $3 million. It lasted until dawn. And it achieved its purpose. Alva forced her way into Mrs. Astor's exclusive social circle by the simple expedient of not inviting Mrs. Astor's daughter, unless Mrs. Astor herself called on Alva first. Mrs. Astor called, but Consuelo's favorite residence was Idle Hour, the family's estate in Oakdale on Long Island. She called it her father's house, the place where the rules loosened slightly, where she could crab and fish in the Connequot River, where she could learn to sail. William Vanderbilt was warmer than his wife, though seldom available. Alva even allowed the children to take over an old bowling alley as a playhouse at idle hour, though she insisted they do all the housework themselves. It was the closest Consuelo came to a normal childhood. The education Alva designed for her daughter was comprehensive and unrelenting. Every Saturday, Consuelo recited endless poems in English, French, and German. By age 18, she'd passed entrance exams for both Oxford and Cambridge. She learned deportment, music, languages, everything a future duchess might need. But she learned no swimming, no tennis, no golf. Recreation wasn't on the curriculum. The only regular pleasure Alva permitted was a weekly dancing class conducted by Mr. Dodsworth, an elderly instructor who taught generations of New Yorkers how to dance and how to behave in company. Consuelo was tutored entirely at home. She never attended school, never made friends outside the narrow circle Alva approved. Her mother hovered constantly, supervising lessons, correcting posture, demanding perfection. In her memoir years later, Consuelo would describe herself as a precocious, introverted child, in the habit of searching her infant soul for faults and judging herself inadequate. This wasn't modesty. This was the result of being raised by a mother who made clear that nothing Consuelo did was ever quite good enough. The steel rod wasn't the only physical modification Alva imposed. She controlled what Consuelo wore, how she moved, how she presented herself to the world. When Consuelo blossomed into adolescence, becoming the beau ideal of a Belle Epoque beauty, slim, delicately pretty, with a swan-like neck and thick, dark hair, Alva took credit. The beauty was natural, the presentation was engineered. Consuelo later wrote that she reflected that there was in my mother's love of me something of the creative spirit of an artist, that it was her wish to produce me as a finished specimen, framed in a perfect setting, an artist creating a masterpiece. A specimen being prepared for display, not a daughter being raised with love, but a product being perfected for market. And the perfect setting Alva had in mind was already under construction, a marble palace by the sea that would become the stage for everything that followed. Chapter 2. The Mother Alva. Erskine Smith was born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1853. Her father was a cotton broker, comfortable but not wealthy. Her childhood included years in France, where she developed a passion for French culture, French architecture, French luxury. When her family returned to America and settled in New York, Alva brought those tastes with her. She also brought ambition that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with power. In 1875, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt. He was 26 years old, heir to a railroad fortune that would eventually total in the hundreds of millions. She was 22, beautiful, determined, and deeply aware that the Vanderbilt name meant wealth but not acceptance. New York society in the 1870s was ruled by Mrs. Caroline Astor and Ward McAllister's list of, quote, four, the families deemed worthy of entering Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The Vanderbilts, despite their money, were considered nouveau riche. Alva intended to change that. The strategy she devised was architectural. If she couldn't inherit social position, she'd build it. She hired Richard Morris Hunt, the first American trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, to design the family's new Fifth Avenue mansion. The Petit Chateau, completed in 1882, was deliberately ostentatious, French Gothic, impossibly ornate, a statement in limestone and luxury. Then came the party. The 1883 masquerade ball cost $3 million. Alva leaked details to the press for weeks beforehand. Building anticipation. She commissioned elaborate costumes. She had herself photographed beforehand in the studio of Jose Maria Mora, dressed as a Venetian princess complete with stuffed doves. And then, deliberately, she failed to invite Mrs. Astor's daughter. The young woman was devastated. It was to be the event of the season. Mrs. Astor's options were limited. She could maintain her daughter's exclusion and her own dignity, or she could bend. She bent. Mrs. Astor came to call on Alva Vanderbilt, formally requesting an invitation. Alva had won. But victory had a price. William Vanderbilt, by all accounts, was an indulgent husband who funded his wife's ambitions without much question. He also, by multiple accounts, was unfaithful. The newspapers by the 1890s were reporting a, quote, five with another woman. Alva simultaneously was observed flirting with Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a neighbor in Newport, and William's close friend. The marriage was dissolving. In 1895, just months before Consuelo's wedding, Alva and William divorced. It was a scandal of the first order. Divorce for a woman of Alva's social standing was virtually unprecedented. Most women in her position simply looked the other way at their husbands' affairs and maintained the facade. Alva refused. She negotiated a remarkable settlement. She kept Marble House, which William had given her. She retained custody of all three children, Consuelo, William Jr., and Harold. She received $100,000 annually, and most remarkably, she survived socially. The divorce should have destroyed her position. Instead, she emerged as a symbol of female independence. A woman who'd proven that wives weren't trapped in bad marriages. A year after the divorce, she married Oliver Belmont. Her social position held. But in 1895, during those fraught months between separation and remarriage, Alva's social standing was genuinely precarious. She needed reinforcement. She needed proof that she was still relevant, still powerful, still someone who mattered in New York society. And she had one asset that could provide that proof: a beautiful, educated, fabulously wealthy 18-year-old daughter about to make her debut. If that daughter married European aristocracy, if Alva could arrange what her friend Consuelo Iznaga had achieved nearly 20 years earlier, then Alva's position would be unassailable. She wouldn't just be the divorced Mrs. Vanderbilt. She'd be the mother of a duchess. This is the context that matters. Alva didn't force her daughter into marriage out of pure cruelty or mindless social climbing. She did it, at least partly, because her own position was threatened, her own future uncertain. The divorce she'd pursued as an act of independence created vulnerability. Consuelo's marriage was the shield. Alva also genuinely believed she was helping her daughter. In later years, after becoming a leader in the women's suffrage movement, Alva would argue that American wives of wealthy men had no real power, no defined social role beyond decoration. English duchesses, by contrast, had responsibilities, influence, meaningful work managing estates, and charitable endeavors. In Alva's calculus, once romantic love inevitably faded, as her own marriage had proven it would, a woman needed something more substantial than affection. She needed purpose. A title provided that. The problem, of course, was that Alva never asked Consuelo what she wanted. She assumed her daughter would eventually understand, eventually be grateful. She wielded what she later admitted was absolute power over Consuelo, certain that a mother knew best. And when Consuelo tried to assert her own will, tried to choose her own husband, Alva responded with the full force of that power. She didn't see it as cruelty. She saw it as necessity. She saw it as love. Years later, Alva would provide testimony about the coercion that stunned even those who knew the family well. She'd admit to forcing the marriage, admit to wielding absolute control, admit to ordering rather than asking. She'd do it without apparent embarrassment, as if these were simple facts rather than confession of psychological abuse. The remarkable thing is that Alva seemed to believe she'd done the right thing, that she'd given Consuelo opportunities, position, influence, everything except choice. After Oliver Belmont's death in 1908, Alva threw herself into the suffrage movement. She funded the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She served as president of the National Woman's Party. She used Marble House's Chinese tea house to host rallies for women's right to vote. She became known as a champion of female independence and dignity. The irony apparently escaped her. She fought for women's right to control their own lives while having denied that right to her own daughter. But perhaps the contradiction wasn't lost on Alva entirely. Perhaps that's why in 1926 she testified so readily to forcing the marriage. Perhaps it was the closest she could come to apology. Chapter 3. The Prison by the Sea. $11 million, 500,000 cubic feet of marble, inspired by Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon at Versailles. Her Richard Morris Hunt's Beaux-Arts masterpiece, a summer cottage with 50 rooms requiring a staff of 36 servants. Marble House, completed in 1892 on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, was designed to establish Alva Vanderbilt as American royalty. Consuelo called it like a prison. The construction had begun in 1888, while Consuelo was still a child. William Kissam Vanderbilt financed it, but Alva controlled every detail. She worked closely with Hunt, becoming one of the first women to collaborate so intimately with a major architect. Her involvement was unusual enough that she'd later earn membership in the American Institute of Architects. She called Marble House, quote, a temple to the arts, a monument to culture and taste. To Consuelo, it felt like something else entirely. The house sits on 4.4 acres stretching from Bellevue Avenue east to 30-foot cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The western facade, facing the avenue, features a curved marble carriage ramp ornamented with cast-iron lamps and a semicircular fountain. But it's the interior where Alva's vision becomes overwhelming. $7 million of the $11 million, almost two-thirds of the total cost, went to marble alone. The foyer features walls, ceilings, and a grand staircase of solid Italian marble, chosen by Alva for its warm hue. Quote 9, she wrote, "The irony is unintentional. For Consuelo, the house achieved exactly that mausoleum effect, regardless of the marble's tone. The grand salon stretches across the southern end of the house, designed for entertaining and covered entirely in 22-karat gold. The walls feature carved wood panels depicting scenes from classical mythology, inspired by the Galerie d'Apollon at the Louvre. The ceiling displays an 18th-century French painting of Minerva, surrounded by designs adapted from the Queen's bedroom at Versailles. This was where Alva hosted the ball for the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, an event with 300 guests that lasted until 5 in the morning, made possible by the house's electric lights, still a rarity in Newport at the time. But the room that matters most to this story is the Gothic room. Alva designed it specifically to house her collection of more than 300 medieval and Renaissance art objects, purchased en bloc from Émile Gavet, a French collector. The room was designed in Paris by the firm Allard & Sons, then shipped to Newport in crates and reassembled. Scarlet wall paneling, a carved stone mantelpiece copied from the Jacques Coeur house in Bourges, France. Stained glass windows imported from Europe. And the ceiling, an ornately ribbed stone ceiling reminiscent of a Gothic cathedral, creating an atmosphere both impressive and oppressive. The Gothic room served as a private museum. Students of art history made appointments to visit. Alva considered it the most significant space in Marble House. She was right, but not for the reasons she thought. This was the room where, in the summer of 1895, Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, would propose to Consuelo Vanderbilt. The scarlet walls, the stone ceiling, the stained glass blocking natural light. It was a fitting setting for what was about to happen. Consuelo's bedroom was on the second floor, designed entirely by her mother, without any input from the girl who'd sleep there. The room features rich reds and deep walnut colors, more medieval than French, more austere than comfortable. In her memoir, Consuelo wrote that she, quote, 10. Even Consuelo's most private space was Alva's creation, Alva's vision, Alva's control made architectural. The house included elaborate dressing rooms, a spectacular staircase rising from the entrance hall, morning rooms, and drawing rooms and dining rooms where chairs weighed 75 pounds each and required a footman's help to be seated. Everything was imported, expensive, historically significant. And surrounding it all was a high wall and heavy drapes that Consuelo specifically remembered. The wall keeping the world out, the drapes keeping the sun, and the sound of the Atlantic surf at bay. The most beautiful house in America, and Consuelo experienced it as confinement. William and Alva's marriage was already fracturing when Marble House was completed. Alva had demanded ownership as a condition of building, perhaps anticipating the divorce. When the marriage ended in 1895, Alva kept the house. After she remarried Oliver Belmont in 1896, she moved down the street to his mansion, Belcourt. Marble House became a storage facility for linens and out-of-season wardrobes, furniture, and memories. Alva would return to it after Belmont's death in 1908, commissioning the Chinese tea house on the grounds in 1914 as a venue for suffrage rallies. But in the crucial years of Consuelo's adolescence, Marble House was the summer prison, the marble cage where she spent season after season waiting for her life to begin. The house still stands at 596 Bellevue Avenue. The Preservation Society of Newport County bought it in 1963 and operates it as a museum. Visitors tour the Grand Salon and the Gothic Room, admiring the gold and the imported stone ceiling. The wall text doesn't mention what happened in that Gothic room in 1895. It doesn't mention the girl who felt trapped there. But the room remembers. Chapter 4. The Lost Love. The single red rose arrived on her 18th birthday. No card, but Consuelo knew who'd sent it. Winthrop Rutherford had been careful all season, maintaining proper distance in public, but the rose was a private signal. He was declaring himself. For the first time in her life, Consuelo Vanderbilt made her own choice. She chose him back. Winthrop Chandler Rutherford was exactly the kind of man Alva should have approved of. Born February 4, 1862, he was the youngest son of Lewis Morris Rutherford and Margaret Chandler Stuyvesant, which meant he could trace his lineage to Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch Director General of New Netherland, and John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts. He was part of Ward McAllister's, quote, 11, quote, the exclusive circle of New York society families. He'd graduated from Columbia College in 1884. Edith Wharton would later describe him as the prototype of my first novels. He was considered the handsomest bachelor in New York society, with impeccable breeding and substantial inherited wealth. The problem, from Alva's perspective, was that he wasn't European aristocracy. He had no title to offer. And Alva had already decided that Consuelo would marry into the British peerage, elevating the Vanderbilt name in a way no American marriage could achieve. So when Consuelo and Winthrop began their courtship during her debutante season, they did it quietly, meeting when they could, corresponding when they couldn't. The proposal happened during a bicycle excursion on Riverside Drive in the summer of 1894. Consuelo was riding with her mother and some friends, but Winthrop managed to draw back from the group, and in that brief private moment, he asked her to marry him. She accepted immediately. They agreed to keep the engagement secret temporarily. Consuelo was about to leave for a long European tour with Alva. The plan was for Winthrop to follow them to Europe, and when they returned to America, they'd announce the engagement properly. It was a reasonable plan. It never had a chance. Alva discovered the proposal almost immediately, though exactly how remains unclear. Perhaps someone in the riding party saw more than they should have. Perhaps Consuelo's face betrayed her when she returned home. However it happened, Alva knew, and she moved swiftly. Suddenly, Consuelo found herself watched constantly. Alva intercepted her mail. Winthrop was refused entry to the house. The European tour, originally planned as a broadening experience for Consuelo's debut season, became something else, a forced separation designed to break the attachment. In Europe, Alva swept Consuelo through drawing rooms and ballrooms, introducing her to titled young men. Prince Francis Joseph of Battenberg proposed. Consuelo declined. Other suitors appeared. Consuelo remained politely disinterested. And then Winthrop followed them to Europe, just as he'd promised. When Consuelo heard he was in Paris, she asked to see him. Alva forbade it absolutely. The confrontation happened back in New York. Consuelo, in what she later described as the bravest act of her life, told her mother directly that she intended to marry Winthrop Rutherford. Quote 13. She wrote in her memoir. Quote 14. Alva deployed every weapon she had. She told Consuelo there was madness in the Rutherford family, that Winthrop couldn't have children, lies designed to make the marriage seem impossible. She threatened to have Winthrop murdered, a threat Consuelo apparently believed given her mother's intensity. She painted the choice as one between duty and selfishness, between family and betrayal. Nothing worked. Consuelo held firm. She was going to marry Winthrop Rutherford. So Alva escalated. She took to her bed claiming a mysterious illness. Doctors were summoned, concerned relatives appeared, and then Consuelo's aunt visited the girl's room with devastating news. Alva had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack. Any further shocks might kill her. The aunt looked at Consuelo with clear implication. "If you persist in this engagement, you'll kill your mother." Consuelo was 18 years old. She'd been raised to obey, conditioned from childhood to defer to her mother's authority. The steel rod had straightened more than her spine. It had taught her that resistance was painful and ultimately futile. And now her mother was dying, apparently, because Consuelo had dared to choose her own husband. She broke. That night she sent an emissary to Winthrop Rutherford with a message. The engagement was off. Alva's recovery was swift and miraculous. Within days, she was out of bed, energetically planning the next phase of Consuelo's debut season. The heart attack, if it had been real at all, had resolved itself the moment Consuelo surrendered. Years later, describing the incident in her memoir, Consuelo would make clear she believed her mother had faked the entire illness. But in the moment, she'd had no way to be certain, and the uncertainty had been enough. Winthrop Rutherford disappeared from Consuelo's life. He remained a bachelor for years afterward, reportedly having affairs with married socialites, including Ava Astor, but never settling down. In 1902, at age 40, he finally married Alice Morton, daughter of former Vice President Levi Parsons Morton. They had 6 children. Alice died in 1917. In 1920, Winthrop married Lucy Mercer, who'd been President Franklin Roosevelt's mistress. By all accounts, that marriage was happy. He died in 1944 at age 82, but that was all decades away. In 1895, Winthrop simply vanished from Consuelo's world, exiled by Alva's will. And Consuelo was left alone, engaged to no one, forbidden to see the man she loved, facing another season of being paraded before eligible bachelors, while her mother searched for a title. The summer of 1895 stretched ahead. Alva had already decided on the next candidate. She'd already issued the invitation. The Duke of Marlborough was coming to Marble House. Chapter 5. The Trap Closes. Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, inherited his title in 1892 at age 21. Along with the title came Blenheim Palace, 187 rooms on 2,000 acres in Oxfordshire, England, and debts so severe that the family had spent years selling paintings, books, anything of value to stay afloat. His father had been largely absent. His childhood had been unhappy, but he was devoted to one thing: saving Blenheim. Social conventions prevented a duke from working for a living. That left one option. He needed to marry money. His nickname was, quote, 15, though not because it reflected his temperament. The name came from his first courtesy title, Earl of Sunderland. Contemporaries described him as, quote, 16. Others used words like, quote, 17, quote, 18, quote, 19, quote, 20, quote, 21. He had his cousin Winston Churchill as a close friend, which suggests he had some redeeming qualities. But overall, the portrait that emerges is of a man rigidly devoted to duty, uncomfortable with emotion, and utterly pragmatic about what his marriage needed to accomplish. The matchmaker was Lady Paget, born Mary Stevens, daughter of a socially ambitious American widow, who'd successfully infiltrated New York's, quote, 23. Lady Paget had married into British society herself, and now acted as a sort of transatlantic marriage broker, introducing American heiresses to cash-poor British aristocrats. She'd already facilitated several such matches. When Alva Vanderbilt let it be known that she was seeking a titled husband for her daughter, Lady Paget knew exactly whom to approach. Alva and Consuelo spent a weekend at Blenheim Palace during their European tour in 1894. Alva met the Duke's aunt and uncle, Lord and Lady Lansdowne, and set her sights on Charles as the ideal match. He had the highest-ranking title she'd encountered. He had a palace. He had a pedigree stretching back centuries, and he desperately needed money. The negotiation could begin. Charles had been seeing an Englishwoman, but he broke off that relationship. By the summer of 1895, he was ready to make the transatlantic journey. Alva invited him to visit Marble House in Newport. The invitation was transparently purposeful. Everyone knew why the Duke was coming. Alva leaked the news to society columns. Speculation built. Consuelo, still reeling from her forced separation from Winthrop Rutherford, understood exactly what was being arranged. The Duke arrived, and Alva waited for him to propose. He made her wait, perhaps enjoying the slight leverage his title provided, perhaps genuinely uncertain. Finally, in late summer, in the Gothic room at Marble House, the room with scarlet walls and stone ceiling and stained glass blocking the sun, Charles Spencer Churchill proposed to Consuelo Vanderbilt. She accepted. She had no choice. The negotiation of the marriage settlement was conducted like a corporate merger. The Duke would receive 50,000 shares of Beech Creek Railroad Company stock, valued at $2.5 million, placed in trust with a guaranteed 4% annual return, $100,000 per year for the rest of his life, with income transferring to Consuelo if she survived him. William Kissam Vanderbilt would pay an additional $100,000 annually to Consuelo during his lifetime, with $2.5 million from his estate guaranteed after his death. The Duke would gain the resources to restore Blenheim. The Vanderbilts would gain a duchess. Consuelo would gain a husband who, when informed of the engagement, was already in love with someone else. Alva announced the engagement in September and immediately began leaking details to the press. Everything was fodder for the newspapers. Consuelo's trousseau, her jewelry, even the gold fastenings on her undergarments. Alva was orchestrating a publicity campaign, building anticipation for what she intended to be the social event of the decade. The wedding was set for November 6, 1895. In the weeks before the wedding, Consuelo was kept under close watch. Alva apparently feared she might try to run away, might attempt to contact Winthrop Rutherford one final time. The morning of the wedding, Consuelo spent alone in her room, crying. A footman was posted outside her door. Not even her governess was admitted, she wrote later. The dress had already been made. The cream satin gown with its 5-foot train, trimmed in lace, had cost nearly $7,000. The wreath of orange blossoms, popularized by Queen Victoria, was ready. The enormous bouquet of orchids had been shipped from Blenheim. 300 policemen were positioned around St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. Thousands of spectators had gathered, waiting for hours for a glimpse of the bride. Inside, the cream of New York society filled the pews, though notably, most of the Vanderbilt family stayed away. The trap was set. The date was fixed. The contract was signed, or would be signed in the vestry, immediately after the vows. All that remained was for Consuelo to walk down the aisle. But first, she had to stop crying long enough for the swelling in her face to go down. Chapter 6. The wedding of the century. The carriage arrived 20 minutes late. When it finally pulled up to St. Thomas Episcopal Church at 5th Avenue and 53rd Street, the crowd surged forward. 300 policemen struggled to maintain the cordon. Inside, the groom waited. Charles Spencer Churchill had arrived late himself, having conducted what sources described as, quote, 26. Now he stood at the altar, prepared to fulfill his end of the transaction. Consuelo emerged from the carriage on her father's arm. The veil covered her face, but anyone who caught a glimpse beneath it could see that she'd been crying. Her eyes were swollen. Her face was puffy. The delay hadn't been about fashionable lateness. It had been about waiting for her to become presentable enough to appear in public. Even 20 minutes hadn't been quite enough. November 6th, 1895. The cream of New York society sat in the pews, watching Consuelo walk down the aisle toward the Duke of Marlborough. The walk itself became infamous. Witnesses later reported that the bride was visibly weeping behind her veil, that she moved like someone being led to an execution rather than a wedding. One observer wrote that she approached, quote, 27, quote. The phrase wasn't hyperbole. Everyone in that church understood what they were watching. The ceremony proceeded according to form. Episcopal rites, traditional vows, the exchange of rings, the signing of the marriage certificate and the settlement documents. 50,000 shares of railroad stock, $2.5 million in trust, $100,000 annual income, all of it formalized in the vestry immediately after the religious ceremony concluded. The business had to be properly documented. Consuelo wore the cream satin gown with its 5-foot train, the wreath of orange blossoms, the veil that partially hid her distress. She carried orchids from Blenheim, an enormous arrangement that must have felt heavy in her hands. The Duke wore formal mourning dress. They stood together at the altar in St. Thomas Church, surrounded by flowers and music and hundreds of witnesses, and they made promises to love and honor each other. Neither of them believed the words. The press coverage was extensive and in some cases brutally honest. Headlines declared, "She is now a duchess," and thousands of women besieged the young woman's home in St. Thomas's Church. The New York Times had been periodically publishing lists of the sums changing hands in these dollars for dukes' marriages. Consuelo's was among the highest. 9 American women made similar matches in 1895 alone. The practice was so common, it had a name. She was a dollar princess. Her price was $2.5 million. The most honest coverage came from Life magazine. The day after the wedding, they published a cartoon. It showed Consuelo kneeling at the altar in her wedding gown, her hands handcuffed behind her back, a chain running from the handcuffs to her mother's grip. Alva stood behind her daughter, literally holding the chain. The artist hadn't exaggerated. He'd simply illustrated what everyone already knew. This wasn't a marriage, it was a sale, and Consuelo's mother was the one who'd arranged it. After the ceremony, the reception took place at the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue. It was a subdued affair by Alva's standards. The most dramatic moment had already occurred in the church. Now it was just paperwork and small talk, and the gradual departure of guests who'd witnessed something they'd likely discuss for years. Many of them had attended expecting glamour and romance. What they'd gotten instead was documentary evidence of what happened when social ambition overrode human feeling. In the carriage leaving the church, the Duke turned to his new bride and delivered his wedding gift: honesty. He told Consuelo that he loved another woman. He told her he'd married her to save Blenheim Palace. He told her he would never return to America, as he despised anything that was not British. The honeymoon had not yet begun, and the marriage was already over. It had never really begun. They left for their European honeymoon that evening. First stop, Paris. The Duke needed to use his new fortune to begin replenishing what generations of Marlboroughs had lost. Shopping would come first. Love, if it had ever been on the itinerary, wasn't mentioned again. The press continued to cover the wedding for days, the spectacular dress, the emotional bride, the stone-faced groom, the social triumph for Alva Vanderbilt, who'd successfully arranged her daughter's marriage to British aristocracy despite being in the middle of her own divorce scandal. Consuelo was now the Duchess of Marlborough. She was 18 years old, and somewhere in New York, Winthrop Rutherford was reading the same newspapers as everyone else, learning that the woman he'd wanted to marry had married a duke instead. The wedding of the century. That's what they called it. And they were right, though not in the way they meant. It was a perfect encapsulation of Gilded Age values: wealth without purpose, beauty without joy, marriage without love. It was the wedding of the century because it showed exactly what that century believed in: money, status, appearances, everything except happiness. Chapter 7. Crossing the Atlantic. Paris was a shopping expedition. The Duke of Marlborough took his new wife to the House of Worth, the most prestigious couturier in Europe, and had her fitted for an entirely new wardrobe. Consuelo stood for hours while seamstresses measured and pinned, creating the costumes a duchess would need. The Duke was dressing her, quote, 32, quote, as she'd later describe it, transforming the American heiress into something suitable for English society. Every gown, every accessory, every detail was purchased with Vanderbilt money. Then came the jewelry. The Marlborough family gems had been sold off decades earlier to cover debts. Now they needed to be replaced. Charles took Consuelo to the finest jewelers in Paris and began acquiring pieces worthy of a duchess. He bought pearls that had belonged to Catherine the Great. He bought pearls that had belonged to Empress Eugenie of France. He bought diamonds and sapphires and rubies, rebuilding the family collection one expensive piece at a time. Consuelo's mother had already given her the pearls she'd received from William Vanderbilt, two fine rows that had their own imperial provenance. Now the Duke was adding to that collection, every purchase a reminder that this marriage was a financial transaction. The honeymoon continued through France and then to England. Consuelo was crossing the Atlantic not just geographically but culturally, leaving behind everything she'd known: the modern plumbing and central heating of American mansions, the relative informality of New York society, her family, her language, her country. She was 19 years old. Her birthday had been in March, and she was moving to a foreign nation to live with a man who'd admitted on their wedding day that he loved someone else. The first glimpse of Blenheim Palace must have been overwhelming. The building had been constructed between 1705 and 1722 for John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, as a gift from Queen Anne to celebrate his victory at the Battle of Blenheim. Sir John Vanbrugh had designed it in the English Baroque style, massive, ornate, more monument than home. 187 rooms. 2,000 acres of grounds landscaped by Capability Brown in the 18th century. It was the only non-royal building in England permitted to call itself a palace. It was also falling apart. The 9th Duke had inherited debts so severe that basic maintenance had been deferred. Paint was peeling, roofs leaked. Rooms had been closed off to save heating costs. The Vanderbilt millions would reverse that decline, but restoration takes time. When Consuelo arrived in late 1895 or early 1896, she was seeing Blenheim at its lowest point. The physical discomfort was immediate: no central heating, no hot water. The palace was drafty, cold, damp in a way that penetrated to the bones. Consuelo had grown up with modern American conveniences. Now she was living in a building that predated the Industrial Revolution, with systems and standards from centuries past. From my window, I overlooked a pond in which a former butler had drowned himself, she wrote later. That's the detail she chose to emphasize, not the grandeur or the history, but the pond and the suicide. The Dowager Duchess, the Duke's mother, lived in a separate wing of the palace. She wasted no time in beginning her own campaign. Shortly after Consuelo's arrival, the older woman started questioning her about whether she was, quote, 34 yet. The interrogations were regular, intrusive, making clear that Consuelo's primary purpose was biological. She needed to produce an heir, preferably quickly. The servants were another challenge. Blenheim employed dozens of people, each with rigidly defined roles in a hierarchy Consuelo didn't understand. Early in her tenure, she asked the butler to light a fire in the drawing room. The man looked horrified. That task was beneath a butler's dignity. He had to summon a footman. Consuelo had violated protocols she didn't know existed. She was learning, painfully, that being an American duchess meant navigating a system designed to exclude outsiders. The English upper class made their views clear. Americans were nouveau riche, lacking breeding, lacking taste, lacking everything that mattered to people who measured worth by ancestral lineage. Consuelo had money, which they needed, but that didn't mean they had to like her or accept her as an equal. The snobbery was constant, expressed in small cuts and cold shoulders and elaborate rules she was expected to know instinctively. The Duke himself was absent much of the time, at least emotionally. He had his clubs in London, his sporting commitments, his obsessive focus on Blenheim's restoration. He'd married Consuelo to save his ancestral home, and now he was doing exactly that, using her money to hire craftsmen, repair roofs, redecorate staterooms. The palace was coming back to life. The marriage was dead on arrival. At night, Consuelo was required to dine with her husband, just the two of them in that enormous palace, sitting at opposite ends of a long table, eating in near silence. "How I learned to dread and hate these dinners," she wrote later. "How ominous and wearisome they loomed at the end of a long day." The dinners became emblematic of the entire marriage, forced, joyless, endured rather than enjoyed. By early 1896, Consuelo was pregnant. She'd fulfilled the first requirement. If she carried to term and delivered a healthy boy, she'd fulfill the second. An heir and a spare, the English called it. Consuelo would later popularize the phrase, but she was living it first, and then she'd have done her duty. Then, perhaps, she could figure out how to survive the next 50 years. Chapter 8. The Gilded Cage. The Duchess of Marlborough's responsibilities were extensive and exhausting. 40 servants managed the interior of Blenheim Palace. 50 more maintained the grounds. All of them reported directly or indirectly to Consuelo. She had to oversee household accounts, plan menus, coordinate the complex schedules required to keep a palace functioning. She had to entertain, elaborate dinners for visiting royalty, weekend parties for aristocratic friends of the Duke, elaborate hunting parties where dozens of guests descended on Blenheim for days at a time. She learned the protocols slowly, making mistakes, absorbing the elaborate rules that governed English aristocratic life. Where servants were concerned, hierarchy was absolute. A butler's responsibilities differed completely from a footman's. A housekeeper controlled different territory than a cook. And a duchess who didn't understand these distinctions marked herself as inferior, American, not truly belonging. Consuelo mastered it eventually. She had to. There was no other option. On September 23, 1897, she gave birth to a son. John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, Marquis of Blandford, would eventually become the 10th Duke of Marlborough. He was also godson to the future King Edward VII, cementing the family's connection to royalty. Consuelo had provided the heir. 13 months later, on October 4, 1898, she gave birth to a second son, Lord Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill. The spare was secured. Consuelo coined the phrase "an heir and a spare" to describe what she'd accomplished. Her primary biological duty was complete. The social success came more easily than the personal happiness. English society, for all its initial snobbery, gradually accepted Consuelo. She was beautiful, well-educated, fluent in multiple languages, capable of intelligent conversation. She became friends with the young Winston Churchill, her husband's cousin and close friend. Winston was everything Charles wasn't: warm, engaging, intellectually curious, interested in the world beyond Blenheim's boundaries. He'd have inherited the dukedom if Consuelo had failed to produce a son, which gave their friendship an interesting undertone. But mainly, Winston was someone Consuelo could actually talk to. In 1902, Consuelo received recognition of her position. She was chosen as one of 4 duchesses to bear the canopy over Queen Alexandra at the coronation of Edward VII. It was an honor reserved for the highest-ranking women in the kingdom. Consuelo had arrived socially. She'd proven she could fulfill the ceremonial requirements of her position, and she was utterly miserable. The tenants on the Blenheim estate loved her. She visited their homes, inquired about their needs, provided assistance when families faced hardship. This was the part of being a duchess that gave her purpose. The English system, for all its faults, gave aristocratic women genuine responsibilities. Consuelo took those seriously. She became involved in charitable work affecting mothers and children, questions of sanitation, milk quality, water supplies, education. She corralled donors for the Young Women's Christian Association. She used Sunderland House, the London townhouse her father had built for her and the Duke, as headquarters for a campaign against the trafficking of women forced into prostitution overseas. Sunderland House itself was palatial, a mansion on Curzon Street in Mayfair. Constructed between 1900 and 1904 at a cost of roughly $2.5 million. The ballroom was so large it required 2 orchestras placed at either end to fill the space with music during parties. Consuelo entertained there frequently, hosting intellectuals and artists alongside aristocrats. H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, Sir James Barrie, Margot Asquith, Lady Astor, Lady Cunard. The Grand Duke Dmitri of Russia all passed through Sunderland House drawing rooms. Consuelo had become what Alva had envisioned, an influential hostess with a defined social role. But being alone with her husband remained torture. The forced dinners, the cold interactions, the growing awareness that they had nothing in common except their sons and their shared responsibility for Blenheim. By 1901, gossip about the problems in their marriage had begun circulating in society. The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough were often apart. They maintained separate residences, he at Blenheim, she increasingly in London. They fulfilled their public duties together when necessary, then retreated to separate lives. The political work gave Consuelo purpose beyond her marriage. She became associated with progressive causes, supporting free school meals for children, free health care, national insurance for workers, old age pensions. For someone raised in Gilded Age excess, she developed surprisingly liberal politics. Perhaps seeing poverty up close in England changed her perspective. Perhaps having been trapped herself made her sympathetic to others without power. Whatever the reason, the Duchess of Marlborough became known for using her position to advocate for the less fortunate. She also became involved in the women's suffrage movement. Following her mother's example, Alva had by then remarried Oliver Belmont, and after his death in 1908, had thrown herself into suffrage work. Mother and daughter, despite everything that had happened between them, found common cause. Consuelo became a regular visitor to the Strangers' Gallery in the Palace of Westminster, watching parliamentary debates, learning how English politics functioned, positioning herself to influence outcomes when possible. But none of it. Not the charity work, not the social success, not the friendship with Winston Churchill, not the two healthy sons, could compensate for being trapped in a loveless marriage. By 1905, both Consuelo and the Duke understood that their relationship existed in name only. They'd stopped being intimate. They lived separately. They were married by law and trapped by duty. But the emotional connection had never existed, and the physical connection had ended once the spare was born. Consuelo was 28 years old. She'd been married for 10 years. She'd fulfilled every requirement placed on her. She'd saved Blenheim Palace with her father's money. She'd produced 2 sons. She'd become a successful duchess, and she couldn't imagine another 40 years of this. Something would have to change. Something would have to break. Chapter 9. Cracks in the Marble. In 1900, the Duke left for South Africa. His cousin Winston Churchill was serving in the Second Boer War, and the Duke joined him there for 6 months. It was the longest separation Consuelo and Charles had experienced since their marriage, and for Consuelo, it felt like relief. With her husband away, she could breathe. During his absence, the French artist Paul César Hillet visited Blenheim. He'd been commissioned to paint Consuelo's portrait. The sittings took place in the spring of 1900, with the Duke still in South Africa. The resulting portrait shows an intimacy between artist and subject that has nothing to do with professional detachment. Hillet's daughter would later state her belief that her father and Consuelo had an affair during this period. The evidence is circumstantial, but compelling. When Hillet returned to Paris, Consuelo visited him there and sat for additional portraits. The Duke and Duchess, by this time, had completely stopped being intimate with each other. But the affair that mattered most had already happened. Sometime around 1899, Consuelo had reconnected with Winthrop Rutherford. 4 years after being forced to break their engagement, they'd found each other again. The details are murky. Sources differ on how they managed to meet, how long they spent together. What's clear is that they spent 2 weeks in Paris, that the flame had never died, that Consuelo was still in love with the man she'd been forbidden to marry. Consuelo confessed everything to the Duke. She told him she loved Winthrop and wanted to elope. The Duke's response was unexpected. He gave his permission. Perhaps he'd already fallen for Gladys Deakin by then. Perhaps he simply recognized that their marriage was unsalvageable and saw no point in fighting. Whatever his reasoning, he told Consuelo she was free to go. She traveled to London to tell Winthrop the news, and Winthrop turned her down. The reasons remain unclear. Perhaps he'd moved on in the 4 years since their forced separation. Perhaps the reality of running away with a married duchess seemed more complicated than the romance of their earlier courtship. Perhaps he simply couldn't or wouldn't upend his life for her. The historical record doesn't provide clear answers. What's documented is that Consuelo made the trip to London, expecting to begin a new life, and Winthrop rejected her. She returned to Blenheim devastated. Shortly after this rejection, Consuelo gave birth to her second son, Lord Ivor, in October 1898. Years later, the Duke's second wife, Gladys Deakin, would privately claim that Ivor was likely Winthrop Rutherford's child. The timing makes it possible if Consuelo's Paris reunion with Winthrop occurred in late 1897 or early 1898. If true, it would mean the spare in the line of succession wasn't actually the Duke's son. But paternity was never formally questioned during Consuelo's lifetime, and Ivor was raised as a Spencer Churchill. After Winthrop's rejection, Consuelo sought comfort elsewhere. She had an affair with Reginald Fellows, the Duke's cousin. Later, she planned an elopement with Charles Vane Tempest Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh, who would eventually become the 7th Marquess of Londonderry. That plan apparently fell through as well. Consuelo was trying to escape, trying to find connection, trying to build something that felt like love. None of it worked. The Duke, meanwhile, had fallen for Gladys Deacon. Gladys was American, like Consuelo, but she had almost no money. What she had was beauty and intellect. Marcel Proust said of her, quote 39, quote, "The Duke was besotted." But divorcing Consuelo to marry Gladys would have been financially catastrophic. The Vanderbilt money was tied up in trusts and settlements that required the marriage to continue. So the Duke and Duchess reached an unspoken agreement. They'd remain married legally, but live separate lives. By 1906, the situation had become untenable. They formalized what had already been happening, an official separation. Consuelo left Blenheim and took up permanent residence in London, first at Sunderland House. The Duke remained at Blenheim. They'd see each other when their sons visited or when public duties required a joint appearance. Otherwise, they were finished. The separation was fairly amicable as these things went. Neither party wanted scandal. Both recognized that their marriage had been a business arrangement from the start, and now the business could be conducted with greater efficiency if they weren't forced to share a roof. Consuelo took a small country house called Crowhurst on the Marlborough estate, maintaining some connection to the property while living independently. The boys, John and Ivor, split time between parents. English divorce law made their situation legally complicated. A man needed only to prove his wife's infidelity to obtain a divorce. A wife needed to prove both infidelity and physical cruelty. Consuelo couldn't meet that standard, or didn't want to try. So they remained married, trapped not by emotion or even by choice, but by law. The marriage that had never been real continued as a legal fiction. It would be another 15 years before they could finally end it. In 1918, the British government requisitioned Sunderland House to accommodate various war agencies. Consuelo moved to a smaller townhouse on Portland Place with her younger son Ivor. She never returned to the palatial London residence her father had built. Another mansion, another symbol of the life she'd been forced into, disappeared from her daily existence. She was 51 years old in 1918. She'd been separated from the Duke for 12 years and married to him for 23. The end was in sight, but still years away. Chapter 10. The Long Wait for Freedom. English divorce law in the early 20th century was written by men to protect men. A husband needed to prove only that his wife had committed adultery. A wife needed to prove both adultery and physical cruelty. The asymmetry was intentional. Designed to make divorce nearly impossible for women while keeping it accessible for men. Consuelo and the Duke had been separated since 1906, living completely separate lives, but the law didn't care. They were still married. The Duke had no interest in divorce initially because of the financial arrangements. The Vanderbilt money, the $2.5 million in trust, the annual income, all the various settlements, was structured around the marriage continuing. Divorce would trigger complications. As long as they stayed legally married while living apart, the money kept flowing. The Duke could use it to maintain Blenheim. Consuelo could use it to fund her charitable work and her London household. The arrangement was functional, if not happy. But in 1920, circumstances changed. The Duke wanted to marry Gladys Deacon, with whom he'd been carrying on a relationship for years. More importantly, he wanted to convert to Roman Catholicism, which required that his first marriage be not just ended, but annulled, declared never to have existed in the eyes of the Church. Suddenly, he had motivation to pursue divorce. The legal reforms of 1920 made the process slightly less onerous for Consuelo. New marital law allowed wives to file for divorce on grounds of desertion, which was provable given their long separation. But Consuelo still had to jump through humiliating hoops. She had to provide evidence that the Duke had been unfaithful, specifically that he'd slept with another woman. She had to submit written proof that he'd rejected her attempts at reconciliation. The process required her to document publicly what everyone already knew privately, that her marriage had been loveless from the start and non-existent for 15 years. Quote 40 was the word Consuelo used to describe the divorce proceedings. After decades of maintaining dignity, of being the perfect duchess in public regardless of what happened in private, she now had to air intimate details for legal record, but she went through with it. In 1921, the divorce was finalized. The Duke immediately married Gladys Deakin. Consuelo, after 26 years, was finally free to marry the man she wanted. That man was Jacques Balsan. He'd first seen Consuelo in 1894 at her coming-out ball in Paris, hosted by the Duc de Gramont. She was 17, he was 26. He fell in love instantly, then watched her marry someone else. For 26 years, Jacques had waited. He'd become famous as an aviation pioneer, balloonist, pilot, one of the early men to work with the Wright brothers. He'd served in World War I, leading aerial reconnaissance for the First Battle of the Marne. He'd built a career, lived a full life, but apparently never stopped loving Consuelo Vanderbilt. On July 4, 1921, they married. He was 52, she was 44. By all accounts, it was a very happy marriage. Quote 41. Sources noted, the contrast with her first marriage couldn't be more stark. Where the Duke had been cold, Jacques was warm. Where the Duke had admitted he'd married her for money, Jacques had loved her for decades. Where the Duke had made her dread the end of each day, Jacques made her happy. But they weren't quite finished with the Duke. In 1926, he petitioned the Vatican for an annulment. Roman Catholic canon law didn't recognize divorce, but it did allow for annulment if a marriage had been forced, if one party had been coerced into marrying against their will. The Duke needed the annulment to formalize his conversion to Catholicism, and to get it, he needed testimony about the coercion. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, Consuelo's mother, provided that testimony. By 1926, Alva was 73 years old, a widowed suffragette who'd spent the last 2 decades fighting for women's rights. She appeared before the English Tribunal of Catholic Priests and testified without apparent embarrassment. I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter. When I issued an order, nobody discussed it. I therefore did not beg, but ordered her to marry the Duke. It's one of the most extraordinary statements a mother has ever made about a daughter. Alva admitted to coercion, to abuse of power, to forcing a marriage her daughter didn't want. And she did it casually, as if these were simple facts rather than confession of something that would be considered psychological abuse. The tribunal granted the annulment on August 19, 1926. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, Consuelo's first marriage had never existed. The annulment meant Consuelo and Jacques had to remarry in a Catholic ceremony, which they did. 2 weddings to the same man, 31 years after weeping through her first wedding to a different one. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Consuelo had spent the first half of her life trapped. She'd spent 26 years married to or legally entangled with a man she'd never loved. Now, finally, she had what she'd wanted all along, a marriage based on love rather than transaction. The Duke's second marriage to Gladys Deakin didn't go well. Within a few years they'd separated, though, unlike his first marriage, this one never ended in divorce. Gladys began injecting her face with paraffin wax in a misguided attempt to enhance her beauty. The procedure ruined her face. The Duke eventually evicted her from Blenheim, turning off the utilities to force her out. At one point during their marriage, Gladys dined with a revolver beside her plate. The whole situation was miserable, vindictive, ugly. The Duke died in 1934, still legally married to Gladys but living separately. He'd gotten the heir and the spare from Consuelo, the money to save Blenheim, and 2 catastrophically unhappy marriages. Consuelo, by contrast, had finally gotten what she needed. In 1926, at 49 years old, she was in a legal Catholic-sanctioned marriage to Jacques Balsan, the man who'd loved her since she was 17. The man who'd waited 26 years. The man who, by all evidence, actually made her happy. Chapter 11. Gold after glitter. Jacques Balsan came from a French textile manufacturing family that had supplied the French army with uniforms since Napoleon's era. The famous Blue Horizon cloth originated with the Balsan Company. His brother Etienne was an early patron of Coco Chanel, making Jacques tangentially part of fashion history. But Jacques' passion was aviation. At the 1900 Exposition Universelle, he held the record for highest altitude flight in a balloon. In 1909, he bought his first airplane. In 1910, flying a Blériot monoplane, he won the Prix d'Héliopolis in Egypt. He held pilot license number 22, marking him as one of the earliest certified pilots in the world. During World War I, General Maunery put Jacques in charge of aerial reconnaissance for the First Battle of the Marne. He'd worked with the Wright brothers. He'd set records in balloons, airplanes, and hydroplanes. While Consuelo was trapped at Blenheim enduring a loveless marriage, Jacques was becoming famous as an aviation pioneer. And apparently, through all of it, he never forgot the 17-year-old girl he'd seen at a Paris ball in 1894. Their wedding in July 1921 was everything her first wedding hadn't been. No crowds of spectators, no magazine cartoons showing the bride in chains, no groom admitting in the carriage that he loved someone else. Just two middle-aged people who'd waited decades to finally be together. Consuelo was 44, Jacques was 52. They'd marry again in a Catholic ceremony after the annulment in 1926, formalizing what everyone already knew. This was the real marriage. They made their first home in France. The Château Saint-Georges Motel near Dreux, about 50 miles north of Paris, became their primary residence. Consuelo had lived in palaces, Marble House, Blenheim, Sunderland House, and now she was in a chateau that was grand but manageable, beautiful but not overwhelming. It was hers in a way the other houses had never been. She and Jacques entertained frequently. Winston and Clementine Churchill visited often, maintaining Consuelo's friendship with the cousin of her first husband. Other guests included writers, artists, diplomats. The tone was intellectual rather than purely social. These were gatherings based on genuine interest rather than obligation. They also had an hotel particulier in Paris at 9 Rue Charles Floquet, a faithful reproduction of an 18th century mansion designed by architect René Sergent. Paid for by Consuelo's father back when she was still married to the Duke. That property had been built between 1912 and 1914 as a London-style townhouse for Consuelo's use. After France fell to the Nazis in World War II, it was sold to the Indian government and now serves as the residence of the Indian ambassador to France. In the early 1920s, before they were officially married, Consuelo and Jacques built a villa at Aisy-sur-Mer on the French Riviera. They collaborated with Achille Duchesne, the landscape architect who designed the water gardens at Blenheim Palace years earlier. The irony of hiring the same man who'd worked on her prison to design her paradise apparently didn't bother Consuelo. Or perhaps it did, and using him was a way of reclaiming something. The Aise Villa became a retreat where they hosted celebrities. The Duke of Connaught, son of Queen Victoria, Jagatjit Singh, Maharaja of Kapurthala, Charlie Chaplin. It was the kind of entertaining Consuelo enjoyed. Small groups, interesting people, actual conversation. Consuelo's mother Alva bought a chateau near Saint-Georges Motel to be close to her daughter. By the 1920s, after decades of conflict, mother and daughter had reached something like peace. Alva had testified at the annulment hearing, admitting she'd forced the marriage. That testimony was probably the closest Alva would come to apologizing. And Consuelo, finally happy in her second marriage, seemed willing to forgive. They spent time together. They corresponded. Whatever damage the forced marriage had done to their relationship was being slowly repaired. Jacques supported Consuelo's continued charitable work. In France, she focused increasingly on children. She ran a summer play school for local children near the chateau. She built a sanitarium on the property large enough to house 80 sick children. During World War I, she'd led a committee providing economic help through the American Women's War Relief Fund. Between the wars, she worked with Winnaretta Singer-Polignac to help build the Foch Hospital in Suresnes, a suburb of Paris, a 360-bed facility providing medical care for middle-class workers. The hospital still operates today as one of the top medical facilities in France. The life Consuelo built with Jacques was everything her first marriage wasn't. She had autonomy, respect, love. She had purpose beyond producing heirs. She had a partner who supported her interests rather than merely tolerating them. Elsa Maxwell, the famous hostess, wrote of Consuelo, "Madame Balsan is a top-notch hostess, and another of the rare ones who are liked for themselves alone. She needed neither title nor Vanderbilt money to win her social laurels. Nowadays, she is at her best as hostess to a few, preferring small parties to large. No doubt she had her fill of the pomp and ceremony school of hospitality during her years as mistress of Blenheim Palace." In her autobiography, published in 1953 with the title The Glitter and the Gold, Consuelo made the distinction explicit. Her time as Duchess of Marlborough was glitter, surface shine without substance. Her time with Jacques was gold, real, valuable, genuine. The book topped bestseller lists for 20 weeks. Some Vanderbilt family members criticized it as indiscreet, arguing that such revelations weren't befitting the family name. But Consuelo was 76 years old when the book was published. She'd spent her youth and middle age protecting other people's reputations and maintaining appearances. She'd earned the right to tell her own story. Jacques Balsan died on November 4, 1956, at their home at 1 Sutton Place in New York City. He was 88 years old. Less than 2 months earlier, Consuelo's younger son, Lord Ivor, had died in London of a brain tumor at age 57. The son who might have been Winthrop Rutherford's child, who'd been raised as the Duke's spare, was gone. And now the man who'd loved Consuelo since she was 17, who'd waited 26 years to marry her, was gone too. Consuelo divided her remaining years between New York and Southampton, becoming a familiar figure in both places. In 1953, at age 76, she published her autobiography. The Glitter and the Gold topped bestseller lists for 20 weeks. The title said everything. Her first marriage had been glitter, beautiful on the surface, hollow underneath. Her marriage to Jacques had been gold, real, valuable, genuine. Some Vanderbilt family members criticized the book as indiscreet, but Consuelo had spent decades protecting other people's reputations. She'd earned the right to tell her own story. Her eldest son, now the 10th Duke of Marlborough, invited his mother back to Blenheim Palace as a guest, not as duchess, not out of obligation, but simply to visit. Consuelo returned to the place that had been her prison for 10 years. She found it was just a house now. Beautiful, historic, significant, but no longer capable of trapping her. The power it had held over her was gone. On December 6, 1964, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died in Southampton, Long Island. She was 87 years old. Her estate was valued at approximately $1 million, most of it from trusts established decades earlier. As stipulated in her will, she was buried at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, Oxfordshire, the parish church for Blenheim Palace. She chose to rest beside her younger son Ivor, not in the Marlborough family vault. Her grave is a short walk from Blenheim's main gates. The choice of burial location completes the circle. Consuelo could have been buried in Southampton, where she'd spent her final happy years. She could have been buried in France, where she'd been happiest with Jacques. She could have been buried on Vanderbilt property somewhere. Instead, she chose to rest near Blenheim, the palace that had been her prison for a decade. The place she'd fled in 1906, counting every day until she could leave. Perhaps she wanted to reclaim it in some final way. Perhaps she wanted to prove that, despite everything, the forced marriage, the years of misery, the decades of being trapped, she'd survived. Blenheim was now just architecture, impressive but powerless. The duchess who'd been a prisoner was finally permanently free.